Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this Kellogg College event on religion and politics, or politics and religion. Well, it of course makes difference how you see it, but we try to look at it both ways. If you, as you have seen in the previous slide, could you please make sure that your video is off and your mics are muted? I try to share some slides with you so that you have some visual, of course, imagination actually of things that I'm saying. That will hopefully try to somehow, make the discussion more palatable. As you can imagine, this is a very complex topic. It's not without, it's unsurprising to see that this topic is actually being left out of most of the books of, the manuals of international relations and diplomacy. Well, of course, because one challenge is that it's very difficult topic to frame. And of course, it's very controversial, in every way you take it could somehow offend someone or somehow make claims which are not contestable in various aspects. So we try to somehow frame it in a way that to provide some historical background of what we call the religions of the West. As you know, there's certain group of scholars, we could say that have come up with these classifications of religions, of religion of the East and religion of the West. Religion of the East are, being those that the relation between the higher authority and higher power, let's say, is indirect. So through, let's say, the observation of nature, through somehow meditation, you could indirectly reach the higher being, the metaphysical power, the God, the nirvana. Whereas the religion of West, as they are called, being Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are those in which, the claim there is that the relation between the subject, obviously human being, with the superior wisdom is actually a direct relation, as we are, the chosen creature of this creator. We are actually have a direct relation in which messengers are being sent directly. We ask things and of course directly communicate with God. So we focus here on religions of the West for several reasons. Of course, just to simplify the talk, because of course the talk will become really complex, because even the very definition of religion is complicated to frame, but also because in this part of the world that we are more somehow concerned with religions of the West, as I said, with these three religions, rather than with Hinduism or Buddhism, which are of course very important, but further away from even the history of political thought, as we see in a way or another, is a development of interaction with these religions that we see here. Let me see if I can share my screen with you. Oh, can you see them? Yeah. Hopefully you can see them. So yeah, these are the framing questions that we try to somehow address today. A little bit on epistemology of religion, the main religious narratives against on state and power, a little bit on the formative stages of religions of the West, their discourse related to power and authority. Then a little bit on Islam and Islamic political thought, which is my main area of study. And of course, the more recent, processes in ideologization of religion, and a little bit of, take a quick look on how these religions actually have had some, impact and implications for international politics. As we see here, so if you consider the development of religions of the West, the symbology of these religions have of course been very important to the development of the Western political thought. Like for example, even the very fact of Jesus, for example, is claimed to be the Son of God, for example. This symbology is something which is already, we notice, being present within the structure of the Roman political power. Julius Caesar, for example, was, as you know, his title is Divus Julius, and of course his son, Divi Filio Julius, which is the son of the divine Julius, the son of God. So at the same period that we have this claim practically that Jesus was, a son, of course, this attribute that we attributed to him, this was actually a recurrent theme that was already present within the political establishment of the time. Tiberius, for example, Caesar August, and various others, of course, assume this, title of being son of God. Then we have, of course, with the Judaism, of course, with the start of the religions of the West, this idea of covenant. So the fact that you make an agreement with God, and then as a result of which you're being, awarded a certain privileges. You're, being chosen as the favored nation. You're being chosen, of course, to occupy certain land, etc., and the territoriality and various questions of power that are being associated with this covenant that you make with God. If you observe Sabbath, for example, if you do, circumcision, if you do various religious injunctions, as a result of these, of course, you are then being granted certain, reward for that. So, of course, this is, as I said, this is the distinction that we have, the peculiarity of the religions of the West, in which there is this direct connection to God, and we have this give and take relation that is being translated eventually into questions of power and sovereignty as well. So, of course, it's a very important element of these, particularly schools of ideology, let's say, is the question of social justice. And social justice, as we see, is a very important element of politics even today. The religious narratives like the camel and the eye of needle, what we can have more than, stronger message for social justice than this one. And all of these, as you know, have permeated, our political thinking as well. So the religion itself, as I said before, is very difficult to define and frame. What is religion? The term religio is, of course, very general term that denotes general obligation, social obligation, of course, to family, society, and of course obligation to God as well. Then this was subsequently used in contrast to seculum. Seculum was the world, and religium was those monks who were living, of course, those monasteries. So this was the root of terminology of this word. So since 17th century, religion, of course, has not been considered as a separate realm of activity, with a different area of interest that was separate from power and authority. And this is the same actually in Islam as well. In Islam, we say deen, and deen is a very general term that, of course, has a much larger, both denotative and connotative meaning that, of course, refers to much larger sphere of life. After, of course, we have after the 18th century, and in particular, of course, with the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, that religion is somehow being singled out as a specific sphere of activity that in need of regulation or privatization or limiting or even being excluded from public sphere. So Reformation, of course, was also very important, as you know, I'm sure. This was an affront practically to the universality of Catholicism. There, Catholicism with a universal message that go, beyond borders, it could not be limited actually to frontiers of a country, is somehow being challenged in the sense that, we have Reformation in which a lot of authority that eventually leads to, Peace of Westphalia and Peace of Augsburg, religion is actually tied to specific territories. As you know, it's curious actually to observe that now you see, for instance, with the Islamic State, with the Daesh in Syria, the first thing they did was to abolish, for example, borders between Syria and Iraq, and they were, of course, their agenda was that because the message of religion there was going to be universal, so it's not tied actually to specific people or territories. So with Reformation, just to go back to our argument on Reformation, with Luther's argument was, as you know, Luther was, of course, in Rome before, and it was sent to Wittenberg University and church later. And then the whole idea there was that, of course, the question was the argument was against indulgence. As you know, indulgence was this fact that religious hierarchy was considered itself, actually promoted itself or presented itself as a kind of medium between people and divinity, actually, that could even forgive sins, even reduce the time of people in purgatory. And of course, at a certain point, actually, the church sends a representative, Johann Tetzel, who was this priest who was sent to Wittenberg to actually sell the paradise, practically, to actually buy sins, marked at a 3 Deutschmark, 3 German mark, to reduce their time in purgatory, as I said. And of course, this is something which is being really, this is the straw that breaks the camel's back, as we can say, that Luther goes on to write his treatises against, of course, this indulgence. And and of course, after that, he's being excommunicated by the church. As you know, excommunication in Reformed churches, in Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, or for other churches, is regarded as disfellowship. And so after his excommunication, and of course, he goes more and more radical, and he starts to completely denounce and break with the church. And of course, as you know, the Pope Leo X actually, as I said, issues this excommunication, after which we have this new trend in Christianity, in which religion is actually being somehow tied and gets new dimension of territoriality. This is reflecting, is of course in the famous declaration, Cuius regio, eris religio, so one nation, one religion, practically, which is, of course, as you know, this breaking out of the structure, pyramidal structure of religion, of Christianity in the West, gives rise, obviously, to various other denominations. That we have Anglican, Puritans, Quakers, Presbyterian, Baptist, Anabaptist, Methodist, you name it. And of course, each one of them, claiming to have, the right interpretation of the faith there. It's very interesting that, politically considering this, that, for example, we have in 1525, we have the German peasants uprising, against their masters, of course, against paying taxes, etc., and wanted to, topple dictatorship, etc. And by drawing upon the Luther's teaching, if you think about it, this is like 250 years before the French Revolution, which is really interesting in a sense of political development there. But interestingly, this is actually condemned by Luther, and he goes back actually to the idea that by freedom that he taught in his teaching, he meant actually spiritual freedom. He never meant the actual physical freedom, because kings and queens are selected by God to protect church, and congregations to choose the authorities themselves. So again, going back to recognizing the authority of the state, and of course strongly tying this political power with the spiritual and religious power. Of course, the politicians back then were also interested in supporting the new religious movement, let's say, there, because, as you know, this is the peculiarity of Europe. Europe being such a, let's say, small continent relatively, and very densely populated, has always been very densely populated, and in need of land. Of course, land was very scarce, and most of the theories, as you know, of political economy of Europe is based on this question of land and land ownership, which is always discussed. If you consider, for example, I don't know, the Marxist theories, for example, most of it is actually, revolves around, the question of land ownership, and of course, later on, the productive needs, based on these resources. So politicians, of course, back then see an opportunity to seize, the Roman Church's land, and of course, they promote, this idea as well and subscribe to it. As you see, that even Reformation had a significant political and economic underpinning, which is interesting to consider. The major, political developments and major, let's say, agreements, major institutionalization, actually, of a state power that we have in history of political thought. We have Oxford Treaty and Westphalian Treaty, and as you know, these are also these are the ones that follow all this religious, mayhem that we have in Europe, all the in war and fighting between different Christian factions. On the other hand, this, as you know, eventually leads to enlightenment, in which the religion itself is actually being denounced, and of course, religion is considered as something irrational, magical, or emotive that need to be completely banished and excluded from the public sphere. One thing that I wanted to mention here, which is I think it's interesting for you to consider, is this question of laïcité. What is laïcité? Anyone is very curious actually to observe that any person who wants to say anything about religion and politics, they usually start, most of the scholars actually, they talk usually by denouncing laïcité, saying laïcité, the French laïcité is the absolute evil. We are not subscribing to that, but we also, and then when they go on to elaborate on their line of thought, you see that actually the distinction is not really that clear. This was the whole, studying laïcité was actually the whole reason that I went to France in 2010 after finishing my studies in Durham. I was actually very interested to, see what are actually the foundation of laïcité and why is this laïcité being so, much denounced actually by most scholars of that were considering the relation between religion and politics. So a lot of most of the scholars that I came across, for example, I don't know, the ancient, the ideologues actually of the various aspects of laïcité, like the Nicolas de Condorcet, we have Victor Hugo, Ferdinand Buisson, we have Leon Gambetta, Jules Ferry, Emile Combes, etc. All of them, most of them actually share certain elements that could be regarded as the main pillars of laïcité. One of them could be claimed to be this, secularism in the field of education. So what most of them actually denounced was the fact that Catholic Church should not dominate the educational system. So public schools should be secular. This was Victor Hugo, for example, is very famous in his declaration, of course, by drawing upon it, Nicolas de Condorcet before, Ferdinand Buisson, and many others. And of course, the second aspect of this was the separation of faith and state. That is, now we, in new terminology, we call this one, privatization of faith. Of course, we have privatization and that historicization, of course, in the sense that we need to study certain events in the historical background. That is why, seeing some of the historical events there as well. So one thing we need to also distinguish here is the distinction between laïcité and laïcism. Laïcism is actually an ideology. So laïcism is a philosophy in which, the idea there is that, religion needs to be completely purged from the state. So the complete abolition of religion, because of course, religion being claimed to be so irrational and magical and emotive, and of course, sources of violence, religion being a casus belli, the only solution to religion is actually complete elimination of religion. Whereas laïcité actually is very different. If you see, for example, you read the Humanist UK, for example, a lot of institutions in UK around Europe now that promote a lot of these elements, which are actually elements of laïcité. So it's good to know actually what are the real claims there and what distinguish them. But there's a lot of most things that goes in there. So based on all these Enlightenment ideas that we have there, we have this secularization theory that, of course, the claim there is that eventually religion will wither away. So as societies, let's say, grow out of all of these emotional and magical and irrational aspects of the society, religion by itself will die away. So this is secularization theory, which of course has been a dominant school of thought, in particular when the studies of modernity, modernité, as they say in French, was concerned. Two events were very important here that actually brought all of these arguments back to the mainstream of political studies. One of them was Iranian Revolution, Iranian Islamic Revolution of 1979, and Polish Revolution. So 70s and 80s were actually this period in which the international community realized that actually religion still could have a say in international politics, and religion could actually even manage a country. An important country like Iran could actually have a theocratic state in 20th century and 21st century. And this was a major, let's say, shock for the international community. That is when we see the studies of religion and politics come a little bit gradually start to pick up there. We have, of course, after that, we have, Clash of Civilization by Huntington, that, as you know, predicts, this significant clash between, of course, East and West on ideological grounds, as you know. We have, Jonathan Fox, for example, who publishes his first essay, I think it was 2001, again, based on secularization theory, and of course, many other scholars that so why is that actually? So the question, the underlying question here is that why do we see this kind of binary as you see? As you see later, I'll show you a couple of slides on the European trends of religion and politics, and how is it in, let's say, Middle East and North Africa? Well, the one reason of this is actually the process of colonialism. Colonialism and post-colonialism played a significant role in reiterating the role of religion in politics. Why is that? Well, if you just imagine a situation that you are somehow colonialized, let's say by Western power, and you want to have an ideology to fight this Western power. What are the available ideologies that you can utilize to fight, let's say, the encroachment of Britain or France or other Western powers in your resources and your land? Well, you have just two alternatives. One of them will be communism, of course, and the other one is native, ideologies. Of course, primarily the main one being religion and Islam, of course. And this is the period in which we have, say the courts we have in Egypt, we have, of course, Maududi and Khomeini and various other parts of Islamic work. By drawing upon these religious exegesis, actually, and extracting various aspects of that, try to bring the religion to mainstream of political thought, actually, political discourse. And it's not actually religious figures. It's very interesting. For example, we have figures like Ali Shariati, for example, who is an intellectual studied in Sorbonne, and again, interpreting the entire, let's say, Western politics of the Middle East in the light of all these religious exegesis and interpretation, which is very interesting to see how religion is actually there being somehow molded and formed actually to play a significant ideological role in politics of those countries. So turning religion into an ideology. One reason, of course, was that the secular rulers of all these countries were, delegitimized. The secular rulers of Iran, of Egypt, of Tunisia, of all, most Middle East countries. And of course, the alternative to these were, so when the secular rulers are being somehow, discredited, so who else remains there? Obviously, there are other public authorities or religious authorities that could, of course, fill that void. Intellectuals were already somehow wiped out and abolished and killed by secular rulers. Secular rulers, most of them were authoritarian. So out of these three pillars of, let's say, group of power containers, let's say, social classes that could do something, the only one that remained actually intact were the religious authorities that we know the result of. So of course, various elements of globalization was utilized by these religious forces there as well. As even Ayatollah Khomeini, for example, the revolution of Iran is considered the cassette revolution, audio cassettes, because those were the new means of communication that easily could copy the speeches and also share them with the wider population. And of course, now religious authorities could travel and to reach. Now we see, for example, how internet, in recent era, how internet is being used by terrorist organizations as one of the means of modernity that is being deployed by these groups and authorities. And of course, this all led, to in certain contexts, in particular in Middle East and Eastern Europe, to actually demand more participation of religious figures in politics. This is very interestingly, this exactly goes at the total opposite direction of what we have in Europe. In Europe, we have a process that a lot of scholars, like Olivier Roy, for example, have defined as paganization of religion in Europe. So the idea there is that Europe has gone to a level now, with a few exceptions, of course, exceptions being Poland in one sense, and Ireland up to some years ago, but even Ireland also is out of that category. So the question here, the idea here is that religion now, in most of the European context, has just been reduced to some ritual and some playing just some public functions like that, rather than actually being holding being a repository for values and spiritual values, and of course salvation and various factors like that. So this process is now being claimed to be complete in most of Europe. Other scholars call it, for example, secularization of religion in Europe, even though there are some data that show, for example, people, I don't know, take part more in religious ceremony. Some scholars have, I think, have claimed, return to politics of identity. But of course, it depends what level of that you're. All of the research is actually around the globe show that religions in Europe, in particular, are actually, on back foot for many from many points of view, actually. And for example, it's very interesting that when even when European Court of Justice, gives some verdict, for example, in Italy there was this case that Italian, of course, religious authorities, they wanted to keep cross in schools and inside the hospital room. And European Court of Justice decided that, well, of course, cross is actually a cultural symbol of Italy, so that should be kept in school classrooms and in hospitals. This actually, the religious authorities took it with a lot of misgivings, actually, saying, no, well, actually, cross is not the cultural symbol of Italy. Cross is a symbol of universalism of church, of salvation, of the worldly values. What culture? It's not like pasta or pizza, which are symbol of Italian culture. So as you see, this is the process that we see that in Europe, that even when we acknowledge the centrality of religion, it is being acknowledged through other channels, which is, of course, very, very different with what it was before. But that is why it's very interesting that a lot of the process that we see, a lot of laws that we see, law against burqa, etc., that we see pass in Europe, they are, it's obviously all of us would see, that they are all against Islam. They're actually law that are passed against Islam. But why is that? Well, of course, one reason is that Islam is, of course, relatively, not completely, but relatively the newer religion to Europe compared to other more established religions, let's say. But on the other hand, Islam is actually a religion. And Christianity and Judaism, the way that they operate in Europe has actually gone beyond this being religion. A lot of things that Islamists now claim in a lot of contexts are actually things that Catholic Church or let's say synagogue would actually dream to be able to claim in European context. But of course, Europe is much beyond those levels. That is why Islam is being targeted, of course, because Islam is representing those values. So some scholars have gone, as far as saying, Islam is actually a different, religion compared to, let's say, Judaism or Christianity, because Islam is an embodied religion. Embodied means that, of course, it contains much greater body of, let's say, laws and regulations and rules and norms. So this is the field on which actually I've done some work. And I would present a couple of slides here to see actually how much of this is true and how much, let's say, politics we do have in Islam, which is now the religion which is being somehow denounced and confronted by most of the laws. Of course, it's true that, for example, the law of against burqa, at the end of the day, the text of the law says this is the law, of course, to ban the conspicuous religious symbol. Of course, the Sikh turban, the cross necklace, etc. But of course, we know that the exact target is, of course, being the Muslims and, of course, those who put on burqa. So Islamic political thought is interesting to consider because, as you consider, I have actually written a bit about this, that the Hijri calendar, the Islamic calendar, is one of the very rare calendars that it starts with the actual start of a temporal power. So the Christian calendar, the Gregorian calendar, starts when Jesus Christ was born. Islamic calendar, on the other hand, starts when Prophet Muhammad actually, migrates from the Mecca to Medina to actually establish a temporal power, an authority, sovereignty. And this is a very important consideration, symbolic consideration, which when you, for example, bring this up in all debates, actually, they say, well, the Quran itself says that you Muslims, you must do exactly what the Prophet did. And what did the Prophet do? What did the Prophet do? The Prophet actually established an Islamic state. So if we don't do what the Prophet did, we are actually not fulfilling our religious duty. We did a kind of a quantitative research in Iran some years ago, on the verses of Quran, and we came up with this conclusion that around 200 of them are actually explicitly legal and juridical. So they do have some political, let's say, background to them, or political injunctions to them. Kadivar, another scholar, Hujjatul Islam Kadivar, also studied the hadith. Hadith are the sayings of the Prophet. So what did Prophet do in certain circumstances, which is actually a very big corpus of knowledge of Islamic source of fiqh, of law. 10% of all the hadith as well are also political and have some political background to them. So this is the map of Islamic world now. As you see, the dark green one in the center is the Shia world. So just a little bit of a quick crash course actually for the, to see what actually led these countries to subscribe to this version, in particular Iran, the Shia version. As you know, the entire Islamic world is Sunni. So from Indonesia on the right to Morocco on the left, they are all light green. They are Sunni world. One country, of course, came up with Shiism and the Shia idea, and that is Iran. And where there is the idea, where there is Iranian influence, being a little bit in Iraq, a little bit of course, North Azerbaijan, in Levant area, and a little bit of Afghanistan. So, it's very interesting to consider that a lot of cultural elements were there, pre-Islamic cultural elements that were there present, that Iranian actually forced into the religion somehow to adapt this religion into some, cultural artifact of theirs, Iranian cultural artifact. Like, for example, the 12 Imam. The whole question is, of course, the succession to the Prophet. So when the Prophet Muhammad died in 632 AD, then there's a question of succession. So who is going to succeed the Prophet? So the entire Islamic world, the one on the right, Sunni, in the red here, believe that after the death of Prophet, there is Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and Ali. So Ali, the bottom one, is the Prophet's cousin, who is the fourth caliph for all the Sunni world, the entire Islamic world, more than 80, maybe 85% of Muslims, which are Sunni. One country, as I said, which is being Shia, is of course they believe in the fact that there was one saying of the Prophet, one hadith of the Prophet, who explicitly appointed his cousin Ali as the successor, as his main successor. Therefore, the fourth caliph on the right, as you see, is the first imam for the Shia on the left. And actually, the Shia go on even to to swear at all the three caliphs. There is that, for example, in the UK you have the Guy Fawkes Day, and in Iran there is Omar Koshan Day. That is the Caliph Omar, the second caliph on top, is actually his effigy is being made and burned in public square. That's to of course. So that is why we have, of course, this ideology there based on, of course, the Persian numerology as well. If you consider, for example, we have 12 imamate Shiism. So 12 imam we have there, 12 being multiplication of 3 and 4, which are 3 times 4, 12. That's why 12 in the Persian cuneiform, 3 was symbol of man and death. And 4 was the symbol of woman and life, and 3 and 4, 7. That's why you have 7 days, 7 is very recurrent. 3 times 4 being 12, that's another sacred number. That's why we could not exceed this limit of luck, which is, we cannot go into 13. Therefore, the 12 imam, of course, goes into the heavens, and at the end of the world, comes back with a Jesus to bring. So this is, again, as you see, a significant political factor to this as well, creating this Shiism by the Buyid dynasty of Persia, of Iran, and of course, Safavid dynasty, the main one, being, creating, of course, this all based on Iranian culture to somehow, opposing themselves to the Umayyad initially, and then, of course, the Abbasid, of course, dynasties of Sunni. And it's very interesting to see how politics actually played a significant role there. So there are, of course, a lot of, in the interest of time, I go a bit quickly here, a lot of other elements there. For example, the linguistic complications of the word Mawla, because it is said that in this Qadir Khom hadith, the Prophet said that anybody who accepted me as his Mawla, consider my cousin Ali as his Mawla. Mawla is an ambiguous word. It means both valley, patron, and also from friendship, to befriend my cousin. So Iranian interpret this as Prophet explicitly mentioned that, Ali, my cousin, is your caliph when I die, rather than going through other ones. So the very interesting thing is that how do you from this domination, let's say, of caliphs that we have there, that these four caliphs, that this authority of these four caliphs that succeeded the prophet for the Sunni world, and 12 imam that succeeded the prophet in the Shia world. How do we extend this to the current political authority? I mean, how could an ayatollah or a caliph in an Islamic world say that I am actually representing, those authorities there? So there are, so in a sense, this is very much related, of course, to the Islamic Revolution of Iran. So now going back to why I said at the beginning that the Islamic Republic of Iran was so important, because in a sense, this was the first time that actually a human agency, a person, an individual, was actually claimed to be the rightful and legitimate authority in the absence of course, the imams or the prophet that were there. So Khomeini used, here I summarize for you all the discussions, that all the narratives that Khomeini put together. So if you go through whatever Khomeini wrote, he actually had these, let's say, four sources of his claim. The first source is this Arabic, this verse of Quran, this verse of Quran that says, those you who believe, in God, whatever, obey the God, obey the Prophet, and obey those in authority from among you. Those in authority. So Ayatollah Khomeini, 1979, 1970, 870, late 70s, interpreted. So who could these, those in authority among you be? Could this be anyone? Could this be a secular ruler? Could this be a corrupted whatever? No, it couldn't be. It should actually be a learned religious authority, i.e., myself. So that was the first, of course, source of his claim. Then, of course, in Kashf al-Asrar and in Hukumat al-Islami, he also lists another three hadith there, 1, 2, 3 there hadith, in which he interprets, three different narrations by the Prophet and Imam to somehow denote that there is a need to actually having a religious authority that, of course, in the absence of Prophet and Imam. And this is exactly how they extended this to, the Ayatollah and the Vilayat al-Faqih that we have today, and in the Sunni world with the Khilafah as well, as you know, with the Islamic State, etc. So Ayatollah Khomeini's discussion, of course, was very important. We have this notion of Vilayat al-Faqih here, this very complex word. Vilayat al-Faqih, Faqih is a jurisprudence, learned religiously, learned authority. So, and then his domination is, of course, something to consider. Based on all these narratives, we have, of course, a lot of master narratives that are being used in all of these political activities, in particular in the religious activities, terrorist activities, the Islamism. So Pharaoh, Jahiliyyah, hypocrite, symbol of battles, infidel invaders, Mahdi, and 72 virgins. These are all different narratives and different elements within the religious teachings that, of course, now being reinterpreted to mean, for example, I don't know, Pharaoh, meaning back then was Obama. Then it became Donald Trump. Now it's Joe Biden. So how the Fir'aun or Pharaoh actually symbolize the political power that needs to be fought. So this is about the Islamic Revolution that I mentioned. So just how, on the other hand, in let's say more secular states, those which are not authoritarian and theocratic, how do religions actually impact the foreign policy strategy? Is through these channels that we have here. So through lobbying, of course, by religious groups, voting behaviors of the voters, for example, you have voting for abortion, for example, whatever. So there, the psychology of all these elements are very important. This is closely related to the personal belief of politicians, for example. So if, for example, Jimmy Carter was, I don't know, had those, let's say, religious convictions, those, for example, evangelical Christian, as he was, those obviously impacted his worldview and the fact that the way he, behaved there. Religion also could impact, the nation's self-consciousness. For example, I don't know, U.S., for instance, consider by a lot of, scholars, they consider, the city upon the hill. So based on, of course, this John Winthrop narrative in 1630, that regards the shining state upon the hill that all the countries should look up to and, of course, learn from. And this, of course, has given rise to a lot of external and foreign policy of the U.S. So I have some examples here, but I think I stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. And I think now, so you can type if you have any questions. And of course, I think there is also the function of raising hand as well to take questions. So if you have any question, we're happy to take, and I'm in the limit of my knowledge, obviously. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I don't see questions. I don't know. Shabbat, are you seeing any comments or questions?
No, no questions yet. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put your hand up, or you can type it in the chat box.
Good. Okay, fantastic. Okay, we have a raised hand. Yes, please. I think Shabbat, can you see?
Yes, my question is about the religious relations changing after the great schism of the East and West churches, and how it affected the other surrounding religions, which are Islam and Tengrism to the east.
Very good point. Well, Islam is of course much more recent compared to Christianity and Judaism. So we have more than 600 years of course, of difference there. So, but of course, obviously, significant processes were carried over. Well, of course, the Holy Book obviously being very comparable, if I want to put it nicely. And of course, yeah, there are a lot of course, within the Islamic world. I don't know if we can say that within the Islamic world, the actual, the rise of Shiism could be claimed to somehow, an imitation of, let's say, the processes that happen in the West. But of course, there are a lot of comparable processes that we say there. One process was obviously breaking down the universality of religion and limiting it to territories, which is, of course, in that case, was limiting it to the Safavism, their territory of Persia, and obviously somehow, delimiting and denouncing the universal message of Islam, which was there. Islam is very universal, of course, like Christianity and Judaism as well. Judaism probably less because it's more tied to, of course, certain being born Jewish, of course, and of course that covenant that you saw. The whole Christianity came to existence when this covenant of Jews, let's say, was broken. As you know, until I would say 70 AD, we could say that there was no actual Christianity up to, let's say, 70 years, maybe even AD, because the Christianity was called the way, and that was of course the Jews then had to decide whether to break this covenant and open the covenant and allow other people to convert their religion, or just to stay among themselves and stay somehow. So in that case, well, of course, that the breaking of covenant and various processes that you could actually take to become Jewish, in that case Christian, obviously the new form of that. And so a lot of these actually happened in Islamic world as well. A lot of these, breaking the universality of the religion there and somehow limiting it to, a territory. So religion, as you know, is closely also related to elements of nationalism and ethnicity as well. Religion is an identity marker. So you see that in many countries around the world, for example, we have, I don't know, in Eastern Europe, why religion is so salient and strong in Eastern Europe, because of course that was the marker of identity against the threat of Russia there, for example. We have religious, you see the close example to us being, Ireland, how religion is actually plays as a significant identity marker there as well. So yeah, religion is also closely related to nationalism, even though, and we see both, this development within the Islamic world, and of course before that we saw in the Christian world as well. good question.
Thank you for your response.
Thank you. Shabazz, do you see any question?
Yes, Fayaz Khan.
Yeah. Fayaz, you can say by
Yeah.
question.
Okay. Thank you very much. It is always a pleasure to listen to you.
Okay.
My question is related to a recent debate initiated by a Dutch parliamentarian to make caricatures of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And it created pretty political tension in the Muslim world, who think that you see Prophet is sacred. We do not consider it freedom of speech and expression. On the other side, the French president endorsed that this is a freedom of speech and religion. So definitely the world is going towards a sharp polarization. So how do you see this unfolding scenario of freedom of speech on one side and protecting religious freedom of the Muslim on the other hand? Thank you.
Very good question. You know, of course, this is the question of the day, the question to answer these days. It's very difficult. You know, on the one side, we need to distinguish between two sets of policies that we are discussing here. One is when religion is in minority. So when religion in a society is actually part of the minority of that society, compared to when religion is actually part of the majority, when a state is actually ruled by a religion. So when religion is minority, is of course there, the claim of protection of rights of religious minority is actually obviously, a very valid claim that needs to be obviously accorded. On the other hand, obviously this goes against, the basic, tenets of the Western political thought. One of them being, for example, freedom of expression. So how do you somehow square this together? In Europe, as I said, as you see, exactly what I said before, it seems like we have gone by far beyond this stage. You know that, for example, Charlie Hebdo, as you know, for years and years and years, published caricatures of Jesus, of Moses, and various other religious figures, the Pope, etc., and nothing happened. But of course, with the Islam, then we saw obviously the consequences there. So one side of it is, of course, not to be offended. This is a very, important aspect to consider. But the other side is, of course, the measured reaction to this as well. If even if someone offends you, you do not go and kill, of course, the journalist of that or things like that. That's, of course, that's, significant, act of violence which should be condemned. So it's very difficult actually to balance, in particular in a society like in the Western countries, in which, as I said, they have gone to this stage where religions are so secularized that they are now part. They're actually, for example, we have religions now, Christianity and Judaism in particular, which are in the forerunners of climate action, which is really surprising actually. If you consider, for example, in most of these religions, the man is actually the ashraf al-makhluqat, the best creature of God, who needs actually to exploit and dominate nature. From there, we have the same thing, the stewardship, of course, in one sense, and of course the dominion, on the other hand, in Christianity we have and Judaism. And going from there to actually claiming, writing Laudato Si and various other things to actually, call for climate action, it shows that how much, the Western religions have come. And this exactly is making this, environment actually, I would say, very hostile towards Islam, in which, of course, the claims that Islam is making is actually nothing extraordinary. We have the same identical claims made by Christian world, by Jews, etc. Of course, years before, denouncing, of course, gays and of course homosexuals, etc. And all these, various, of course, worldviews which are shared between these religions. But of course, in Islamic sense, with the problem is that we have this incompatibility of these. So maybe in a sense, of course, effort needs to be made by both sides. And in one side, we have like the sad claims by the likes of Angela Merkel and back then Nicolas Sarkozy and before by many others, saying that pluralism is dead. This is really actually a sad claim, saying that Western societies cannot be pluralistic. So of course, the main reason obviously being that they're targeting, of course, the fact of the interaction with Islam, because I still believe that we do have a lot of shared values that go by far beyond our differences, which could easily actually be shared in the society. Of course, each side needs to obviously somehow learn to speak the same language of civilization, the same language of civility. Which if everybody adheres to, will be difficult. But of course, I agree there is no easy solution to this, obviously, because of course different backgrounds with religions and different evolutions of the processes that these faiths have been through.
Thank you very much for your comprehensive answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Shawab, is there any?
I don't think there's any more questions unless anyone has anything else they want to ask. I'd like to use this opportunity to say thank you to Vahid
Thank you very
for
much.
giving up his time. Thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you very much. Thanks everybody. Have a great evening to everyone.